Hello, this is Jeremy speaking from the editing booth. This episode requires a little bit of an introduction, as you will probably notice the audio quality doesn't sound quite the same as our other episodes, other than maybe the East German one. And that's because it is the second episode we recorded after coming back from our hiatus. We chose to re-record the first Ukraine episode and not the second one, basically because the issue was primarily with Tony's audio. But since Tony was not the host on this episode, he spoke a bit less than he did on Ukraine 1, which we decided to re-record for that purpose. It is densely packed with information. It is almost, but not quite as depressing as Ukraine 1, but hopefully you get a lot out of it. It's very educational, and it helps to undermine a lot of the ridiculous narrative surrounding Stepan Bandera and the OUN. In any case, solidarity forever.
Welcome to Proles Pod.
Hello and welcome to Proles Pod, your bi-weekly dose of history, politics, and culture without the liberalism. You can find and follow us on most social media platforms at ProlesPod and on TikTok at proles.pod. If you want to help us reach more people, leaving 5-star reviews on any of the various podcast catchers is the best way to do that. If you want to help us with our vision, you can subscribe to our Patreon over at patreon.com/ProlesPod. There's a lot of great stuff there, such as early access to main feed episodes, bonus episodes, theory beats, study guides, raffles, surprise drops, and more, with more on the way. This episode is brought to you by Cossack Costumes. Their sponsorship enabled us to buy these super fancy Hammer and Sickle branded Vibram toe shoes. Oh my God, stupid. Anyways, today we're going to be talking about Ukrainian history. But before we get started, it's a very small crew today. Who do we have with us?
We have your co-host, Tony. It's good to be here again for this episode.
Today's subject matter expert is going to be Justin. And where would you like to begin?
Well, we're going to kind of pick up where you left off for the most part with now you led us up to essentially World War I, right? And then the pogroms that occurred during and after.
Right. So we ended on the civil war that wasn't really a civil war in Ukraine from 1918 to 1921. In 1922, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic was founded. And then I guess, that's where we finished off.
Yeah, and that's about where I'm going to pick up, minus a couple of things that we'll reference backwards. And then into the main thrust of this discussion will be the formation and actions of the OUN, or Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, and then later their military insurgent wing, the UPA, or Ukrainian Insurgent Army.
Okay. Is there any kind of context you need to provide for that in advance, or is it just going to kind of open up as it goes?
No, I think it'll open up as it goes. I'm just going to kind of run through all of that, but I want to start with kind of because I think there's so much uncertainty and division around like the role of the Ukrainian nationalists in the Holocaust, and the overriding narrative, especially among liberal historic institutions, is that, they were reluctant allies with the Nazis. And then, once the Nazis told them that they couldn't have their own state, then they started to fight the Nazis also, but were heroically fighting the communists also. And that, while there were some tragedies that happened, it wasn't a policy of the OUN or the Ukrainian nationalists in general to engage in pogroms or anti-Semitism or any of that stuff. And it is like just really, really easy to prove false. And I think that by the end of this episode, it'll be impossible for anyone to deny with any sort of conviction that they were a, quasi-fascist or fascist organization that was heavily anti-Semitic and engaged in some really fucking disgusting things, and then tried to whitewash their history along with the help of Western intelligence services.
Right.
But yeah, so I wanted to start with a quote that kind of sums up, I guess, that thesis, right? So before he was killed in the German-occupied death camp in Majdanek, Poland, and again, just like last time, I'm going to mispronounce a ton of these words, and so are Polish and Ukrainian comrades. If you're listening, I'm real sorry. A Jewish historian, Ignacy Scheiper, said, "What we know about murdered peoples is only what the murderers vaingloriously cared to say about them. Should our murderers be victorious, should they write the history of our war, our destruction will be presented as one of the most beautiful pages of world history, and future generations will pay tribute to them as dauntless crusaders." Now, like the defeat of the Nazis at the hands of the Soviet Union made sure this particular vision didn't come true, but the expedience of the U.S. having anti-Soviet Ukrainian allies certainly did. And it really kind of rang true to me, the quote, because of the portrayal of the OUN as like this anti-Nazi, anti-communist, fighting force that was heroic. And, and that's because, while the Nazis didn't win the war, the U.S. did. And the U.S. was then able to very easily, retell history.
Right. Yeah. And I think too, this is probably going to come up because I know there are some tie-ins between what happened 1918 to 1921, the fallout from that, when certain nationalist heroes were charged with either aiding and abetting pogromists, being pogromists, or at least not doing anything to stop them. But you have to remember that this is like not even a full generation between 1921 and when is the OUN founded?
1929, I believe.
Yeah, so we're talking about this would have been some of the same people who were involved in pogromist activities during that first wave would have joined the OUN when it was founded. And then even when you get into the 1930s and the 1940s, you're talking about those same people would still be alive, but their children would be joining. And to imagine that within a single generation, even under Soviet control, that kind of ideology is going to get stamped out or even suppressed to any large degree, I think is probably naive.
Yeah, well, so, and I'll talk about this again in a little bit, but the OUN actually looked back at those guys as weak. Like they thought they were too weak, too soft, and they should have gone further and been more militant. And then they would have been able to establish this Ukrainian state that they all dreamed about.
Jesus.
Yeah. And it really starts with after the war, World War I, Yevhen Konovalets and Andriy Melnik, who would eventually become the first and second leaders of the OUN, were prisoners in Galicia and ended up escaping and decided instead of going back to Ukraine or their homes or whatever, that they would fight against the Bolsheviks and the whites in hopes that they could form a Ukrainian state. So they formed the Sich Riflemen and with other escaped prisoners in Kiev. They were, of course, defeated again, imprisoned again in Poland, and then released after the war, where they were returned to Galicia and formed the Ukrainian Military Organization, or the UVO, which received funding from Germany and Lithuania and also did like spying espionage for them both. And they also got arms from them. And this was like the predecessor to the OUN. But in World War I, the ethnic Ukrainians who didn't have a state because there had never been a Ukrainian state fought on the sides of the Russians as well as Austrians, where they learned a bunch of military and insurgent skills. And this is kind of similar, like on the other end of the spectrum, basically, to the Soviets, right? The Bolshevik Revolution wouldn't have happened probably if it wouldn't have been for like veterans of World War I, like coming back with combat training and all of that and weapons and all that kind of stuff, right? So after World War I, previously unknown states like Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Finland, Latvia, and Estonia were formed, and long dead states like Lithuania and Poland were revived. And when the Ukrainians failed to do so in this process, it really kind of chafed at the nationalist movements that were based in, what they consider ethnic Ukraine, and became the basis of the 10 Commandments of Ukrainian Nationalist. So just to address some of them, like some of them are boring, right? Like uneventful, but here's some of the commandments. The first commandment: you will attain a Ukrainian state or die in the struggle for it. Other commandments included using the Ukrainian language at all times and places, honoring Ukrainian activists and despising renegades, refusing non-Ukrainian wives, otherwise, quote, your children will become your enemies, and not having anti-Ukrainian friends. So at least like the Ukrainian nationalist movement had previously kind of been left-leaning in the late 1800s, like when Marxism was really kind of coming into its own. But at this point, it quickly drifted right, since the left was, too, quote, democratic, too communist, too weak, and too accommodating to get the job done.
The one about having only Ukrainian wives is like a very particular sub-branch, I feel like, of the 14 words, to be honest.
Yeah.
You must secure a future for our Ukrainian children or whatever.
Gross.
Yeah, it sounds like it's an anti-race mixing, anti-miscegenation
Right.
sentiment.
Yeah, if you have a non-Ukrainian wife, you're not going to have a Ukrainian state, which is, I mean, that is enough. They, in those two books that I read for like the most of what I drew on, there seemed to be a lot of this. I'm not even sure the right word here. It's not really equivocation, but they attempt to say, oh, well, these Ukrainian nationalists, at least the ones who formed the People's Republic, wanted a multi-ethnic state. And that's what they were aiming for. But this sort of, I don't know how deeply this ideology had seeped into that government, or whether it was really like a fringe thing for those folks who were ostensibly socialist for the most part, although not exclusively, but saying we need Ukrainian wives, you can't have non-Ukrainian friends, you're going to die if you don't establish a Ukrainian state. Like that all contradicts that multi-ethnic foundation, I suppose. I don't know how disconnected these folks were from that broader state, but yeah.
I mean, they were all part of the same thing. Like, and so the 10 Commandments would later, like once the establishment of the OUN came about, would be rewritten and then adopted by the OUN by one of Stepan Bandera's buddies, Lenovsky. And he wrote the same thing. So like the first commandment's the same, you'll attain a Ukrainian state or die in the struggle for it. The seventh was, you will not hesitate to commit even the greatest crime if the good of the cause demands it. The eighth, with hatred and deceit, you will receive the enemies of your nation. And the 10th, you will strive to expand the strength, fame, wealth, and area of the Ukrainian state, even through the enslavement of foreigners.
Ooh.
Yep.
Sounds like Lebensraum.
Yup. As the Transcarpathian Rus or whatever.
As the Carpathian Rus. Yeah.
Yeah. So all of that stuff got redivided after World War I. Poland became, absorbed Galicia and Volhynia, which were the western parts of ethnic Ukraine, and would basically be the home base of the OUN and like the fascist movement for the entirety of the next 40 years or whatever. Czechoslovakia was Transcarpathia and the Prešov region. Romania was Bukovina, and the Ukrainian SSR was all of the rest of them. And after Poland took over, where a lot of the right-wing Ukrainians were in Galicia and Volhynia, they ended up destroying the Orthodox Church and replacing it with the Roman Catholic Church. And this really helped push Ukrainian nationalists really far right, because a lot of them were involved in that. I mean, I'll talk about it in a minute, but a lot of the founders and major players in the OUN were literally the children of, Greek church clerics.
So who was destroying Orthodox churches or
Poland
was okay.
replacing it with Roman Catholic Church.
Okay. Yeah.
And so then like the UVO, the precursor to the OUN, just like the OUN later, was mostly a terrorist organization. They weren't like a political party or anything. They robbed post offices, they burned Polish estates, assassinated Polish civil servants, police, as well as like not just Polish, but also Ukrainians that either operated with the Polish authorities or in any sense like weren't militant enough. And this was a running theme among both organizations. They murdered Ukrainians in public sectors that violated the boycott of the 1922 Polish elections. They also received, like I said earlier, funding and weapons from Germany and Lithuania, who both had territorial disputes within Poland. And so they were more than happy to help this fledgling terrorist organization. But the OUN itself was founded at a Congress in Vienna in 1929. And their original vision was a dictatorship in the hands of the OUN once they had established this, mythical Ukrainian state, until they felt comfortable handing it over to a right-leaning liberal, quote unquote, democracy. That was the belief
of Franco supporting sort of fascists in Spain. It was also the belief of Pinochet in Argentina that you needed a dictator to basically oppress leftists within your and to be honest, it's not completely dissimilar from kind of the policy of, it wasn't a dictatorship in the Soviet Union, but you need a strong state to oppress right-wing elements until such time as they are under your thumb, and then you can loosen your restrictions to some degree. But that's a somewhat similar ideology, I guess.
The method itself is not like necessarily bad.
No,
but it's just a matter of who you're persecuting in that.
Right.
With that power, right?
Yeah. If you are doing good things, then that's a good thing to do. But if you're doing bad things, then that's a bad thing to do.
Right. Which is why this like horseshoe theory shit never actually so stands. Yeah.
And I think anybody who has like a rational understanding of how politics function, you kind of have to accept at some point that until you are able to get control of the various media, education, other propaganda, the economy, the military, until you have all of those things completely under your control, you cannot just allow anyone to kind of move in and take back the gains that you've made. And it doesn't really matter what your ideology is. That's the reality of things.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just make a quick point. So as an example of kind of what you're speaking about, up until, roughly, I guess, from the start of the Soviet Union to about 1936, certain classes, so particularly the so-called exploiting classes in the Soviet Union, so like landowners, capitalists, people who were clergy in the Orthodox Church, those are the groups of people who had restrictions on sensitive citizenship when it came to voting, when it came to a whole host of rights. But all of those people were like minority groups who were being oppressed to be exploited, right? This was actually, essentially trying to undo and to reshape society so that it was geared towards the majority and not the minority.
Right. It wasn't a desire to like create an ethno state with just Ukrainians in it.
Yeah.
And so like after the establishment of the OUN, the leadership kind of waffled back and forth on whether that this project was going to be an actual political organization or whether it was going to be a terrorist organization like the UVO. But like they didn't even get to make that decision because that next summer, OUN students that were on vacation burned down farm buildings, stacks of hay and grain, cut telephone wires. The main thrust of the actions was against Poles, but also Jews, of course. A circular Polish authorities found among the OUN youth ordered them to, quote, destroy the buildings of Jews, Poles, and Polish colonists. And the Polish government responded, of course, with massive repressions, which just created many more Ukrainian nationalists. But by 1934, so 4 years after the establishment of the OUN, the youth, led by Stepi, were already firmly in control of the action side of the OUN. And while Stepi was too much of a coward to kill anyone himself, he was one of the main figures ordering assassinations, including a Ukrainian teacher from the university that spoke out against the OUN's influence on the students there.
Hmm.
Now, the first leader of the OUN is Yevhen Konovalets, who was the leader from 1929 until his assassination in 1938. And then he was replaced by Andriy Melnik, who led until the split in 1940, which created the OUNM, Melnik, and the OUNB, Bandera, which formed because Bandera and his group felt like Melnik wasn't militant enough, committed enough. Now, Hitler's ascension in 1933 really kind of encouraged the far right Ukrainian nationalists, and they welcomed him as a leader that wanted to destroy the Versailles system and redivide Europe along ethnic lines. He was anti-Soviet and anti-Polish, which made him basically a hero. And many of the Ukrainian students at that time dreamed of being the Führer, the Duce. And they would debate in school about whether, Nazi Germany or fascist Italy had a better system. The Nazis, however, were much more popular for their ideas about the Jews. In 1935, Ihor Rilly wrote that Hitler fascinated Western Ukrainians because he, quote, wrote on his banners, "Die Jew," because the Jews were the propagators of the communist pattern and he was striking at the foundations of communism.
Christ. Yeah, I understand that the Judeo-Bolshevik myth persists, but it is always wild to me when it pops up over and over and over and over. There's no logic to it, but it just persists forever.
Yeah, and it did absolutely. And then the war, of course, made it worse because the Soviet Union pushed the Nazis out, and then they were super pissed.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the origins of the OUN's ideology. For example, Ukrainian geographer Stepan Rudnitsky was a very important one that helped create and this is great, the quote unquote Ukrainian race for the nationalists to hold to. His theory was that for 1,000 to 2,000 years, the Ukrainian race has resided in this region, this is a quote, and has been able not only to preserve its boundaries, but after heavy losses, to regain and even pass beyond them, end quote. And he described this race as of, quote, tall stature with long legs and broad shoulders, strongly pigmented complexion, dark, rich, curly hair, rounded head, and long face with high, broad brow, dark eyes, straight nose, strongly developed, elongated lower part of the face, medium mouth, and small ears.
What the fuck, man?
Yeah. So that was the...
I don't think it matches at all with the description, but as you were speaking, I was thinking of that Mega Chad meme.
Mega Chad is...
It probably doesn't match the description at all, but that's what I saw. That's how they saw themselves.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
So many OUN apologists point to the fact that many OUN members would deny being fascist even during the war as proof that they weren't fascist. But even this is really only a result of their arrogance and stupidity. From the OUN papers in 1933, quote, "There is no universal doctrine on fascism. Fascism is an exclusively Italian phenomenon. Our socialist opponents call us fascists, but we ourselves do not identify as such." End quote. And they claimed that Italian fascism was a movement of a nation with a state, while Ukrainian nationalism was a movement of a nation without a state. So therefore they weren't fascist.
Okay.
Yep, that's their logic. So 1938, now we're getting, closer to World War II. OUN leader Stetsko, who was Stepan Bandera's second in command, wrote that Jews had taken over all the trade in Ukrainian lands and lived by, quote, deceit, exploitation, and serving the enemies of Ukraine, end quote. Another text that year by one of their ideologues, Vladimir Martinets, said that, quote, parasitic Jews used taverns and usury to acquire peasant lands, end quote. And I point this out, of course, just to display that even before they were in the thick of slaughtering tens of thousands of Jews, they were already anti-Semitic. So in official policy, right? So there's no way to look back at this and be like, they weren't actually anti-Semitic. They were fighting the Nazis and the communists. OUN's Radio Vienna said that Jews had reduced the Ukrainian population of Carpatho-Ukraine, formerly Subcarpathian Rus, to total economic dependency because they, quote, lent money at exorbitant interest and opposed Ukrainian private sector business in any way they could, including illegally, end quote. Nationalist paper Nove Selo wrote, quote, in our foothills live thousands of all kinds of alien freeloaders, and mostly Jewish ones, who exploit our peasantry without mercy, end quote. Another article, quote, the Poles have the government offices, the Jews everything else, and we nothing.
Oh,
poor Ukrainians. In 1941 organizational document titled, quote, the struggle and activities of the OUN in wartime, end quote. So this is like in the middle of World War I, stated, quote, if there should be an insurmountable need to leave a Jew in the economic administration, place one of our militiamen over him and kill him for the slightest offense, end quote. Yeah. The OUN-M, Melnick, their Western leader, who's Martinet's, the guy I just talked about, said, quote, for centuries, Jewry has been the support of our national enemies, the bulwark of their regimes, a denationalizing factor and declared enemy of Ukrainian statehood, and moreover, an enemy of the Ukrainianism as a national phenomenon, end quote. He also said that Jews could not be assimilated because, quote, from a racial point of view, this is an element unsuitable for mixture and assimilation. The result would not be the liquidation of Jewry, but the Jewification of our nation, end quote.
So that guy was the more moderate.
Yes, this is one of the leaders in the moderate OUN.
On the moderate wing
section.
of the OUN.
Yep.
Oh, okay. So I'm starting to get a picture here. It doesn't seem like what Ukrainians told me about Stepan Bandera or the OUN.
Oh yeah,
seems to jive with.
Ideologically, the difference between the OUN-M and the OUN-B is like negligible.
Is it like how violent they are?
Yeah, so like the OUN-M wanted to collaborate more and like build relationships with these major nations so that when the war was over, they would be able to negotiate the formation of a Ukrainian state. And the OUN-B felt similarly, but in the meantime wanted to like get on the ground and just like kill as many people as they could, basically kill any resistance that might spring up after they created this Ukrainian nationalist state. And then, they just bickered over stupid shit, which I'll talk about.
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me to some degree of, I don't know, probably 7-8 years ago, I think it was, there was a conference of white nationalists in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and they met to talk about what their future plans were. And they had a split over whether ethnic cleansing could be done peacefully or not. Yeah. Like some of them were like, oh, well, all we need to do is provide the means of transportation and offer these people to voluntarily leave our white ethno state and they'll go. And then on the other side were these people who were like, no, they're never going to leave voluntarily. We're going to have to kill them or violently force them into exile. And that's why they split in this conference.
Yeah. And that's essentially the initial debate among the OUN before the students. I didn't read that Stepan was there in the summer of 1930. But he was very active. He was like the leader of the student OUN organization before he became a leader in the OUN. But before they decided for the group, there was that same, question. Do we give them their own cities and towns, or do we just like exterminate them or push them into other countries? And the official documents would still sometimes say those things, like that they didn't want to murder all the Jews, but they wanted to make them like kind of like the ghettos, right? Make them live in places by themselves where they couldn't engage in like trade or anything. But, amongst themselves, that was never an option, right? That was never the thing that they were going to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I wanted to take a second here to draw a contrast between what you just described was the position of Ukrainian nationalists and how it differed specifically from how the Soviet Union treated Jewish people. So I have a quote here. It's from Joseph Stalin.
My boy.
You may have heard of him.
Never heard of him.
This is Never heard of him, yeah.
Who?
So in 1931, this is from, it's a letter dated January 12th, 1931, and it's a reply to an inquiry the Jewish News Agency in the United States. So reading from the letter, it begins, national and racial chauvinism is a vestige of the misanthropic customs characteristic of the period of cannibalism. Anti-Semitism, as an extreme form of racial chauvinism, the most dangerous vestige. Anti-Semitism is of advantage to the exploiters as a lightning conductor that deflects the blows aimed by the working people at capitalism. Anti-Semitism is dangerous for the working people as being a false path that leads them off the right road and lands them in the jungle. Hence, communists, as consistent internationalists, cannot but be irreconcilable sworn enemies of anti-Semitism. In the USSR, anti-Semitism is punishable with the utmost severity of the law as a phenomenon deeply hostile to the system. Under USSR law, active anti-Semites are liable to the death penalty.
Damn.
Yeah. And like, so the people that wrote the books that I pulled my stuff from were not nearly as gross as the ones that Jeremy had to read from. But they were still, of course, like rabidly anti-communist, right? And so one of the things that they point to, of course, to be like, well, sure, the OUN was clearly very anti-Semitic, but also the Soviet Union persecuted Zionists, right? And that's like so the Soviet Union was anti-Semitic, but as I'm sure everyone is learning this year, Zionism is a thing.
It is.
Now I'm going to kind of backpedal just a bit to kind of start to explain the building of like the Bandera cult and how he kind of rose to prominence. On the 15th of June, 1934, Polish Interior Minister Bronislaw Peraki bid adieu to Joseph Goebbels, who was on a diplomatic tour, and he returned to his office. That night, on his way to dinner, he was passed by 21-year-old OUN assassin who had never successfully assassinated anybody, who walked past him shaking a package covered in the Gajewski confectionery paper. This makeshift bomb that Hiroshi Matseko was trying to detonate failed, as all of his other assassination attempts had. But this time, he would not be beat, so he pulls a gun from his coat, shoots Peraki in the back of the head twice, then missed the third shot, even though he was prone, and then fled and escaped later to the fascist bastion of Argentina and lived all the way till 1966, where he died an alcoholic. Now, the Polish government like immediately cracked down hard on the OUN, and then that just kind of turned, they tried to turn Peraki into a martyr, which just enraged the OUN sympathizers more. And Stepi, who had been arrested by the Polish police the day before, really used this moment to leverage his, platform as an illegal dissident to begin to build on his cult. And when I talk about cult, it's easy to me to draw a line between, how false the cult, Stalin's cult, it was, or at least as far as it was perpetrated by himself. But in this case, like Stepan Bandera was like really into promoting himself. Like he really thought he was the shit. So Stepan, he ends up going to trial so because of this murder of Peraki, the OUN becomes infamous among the Polish government and citizens and famous among Ukrainian nationalists. And so this trial, which would have been probably just been like a wet noodle, ended up being like this media frenzy, right? So all of a sudden, Bandera has this platform and the courthouse is packed with press, which was perfect for Stepi, despite the fact that for weeks he had denied all ties with the OUN. So it's not like he came in like this, I'm a proud member of the OUN. Mm-hmm. He even said that, listen, we're not even similar ideologically. But once he was in front of the press, he refused to speak Polish. He would only speak Ukrainian in the courthouse. And he proclaimed that since the other OUN members on trial didn't have a lawyer, that he wanted to dismiss his lawyer so that he could be a man of the people. And so once the press was gone after the day's events, he, of course, withdrew that dismissal, and then his lawyer came back the next day. Another day, the he told the court that he was Ukrainian, and so the Polish laws didn't apply to him. And when he refused to stop shouting, the police took him away, and the cult grew. Another day, an OUN witness, Vera Swinicka, also refused to speak Polish, and she was a witness. So the court fined her 200 zlotys and ordered her removed. As she passes the defendants, Stepan among them, she raised her right arm and gave the first public OUN fascist salute and shouted, Can you guess? Can you guess what she shouted, Tony?
Slava Ukraini.
Yep, she shouted Slava Ukraini.
While she was doing a fascist salute.
While she was doing a fascist salute in front of the OUN
Incredible.
Prisoners.
And now, a word from our sponsor.
Howdy, partners. This is your buddy Cowboy Cal. Why don't you mosey on down to Cossack Costumes for a great deal right now? Are you looking to project strongman energy on a budget? Think Cossack Costumes. We've got it all, from Ataman to Hetman. So what if they're the same thing? You're gonna look finer than a frog's hair split 4 ways. Dress to impress at Cossack Costumes. Distinguish yourself from the Nazis, but not too much. Draw on the right sort of cultural and historical touchstones. The right sort. Have you got a reactionary movement you want to get off the ground? Do it in style. And don't you worry yourself none. Cossack Costumes has an exclusive contract with Western Intelligence Services. Whether you buy or rent, Cossack Costumes guarantees that your legacy will be upheld if you win and whitewashed if you lose. So come on down. We're located between Federal and Bandera Boulevard, right off the Beltway.
And now, back to the show.
At the end of it all, of course, everyone was declared guilty. Bandera, Lebed, Karpinets were sentenced to death. But as further evidence that there is no God, the Polish parliament had just ruled 11 days earlier that capital punishment would be abolished. So they got life in prison. And once they're done reading the verdict, Stepi and his bestie, another of his besties, Lebed, stood up, gave the fascist salute, and called out,
Slava Ukraini.
Slava Ukraini. At the end of their failed appeal 3 months later, Bandera shouted in court, "Iron and blood will decide between us." And all the other defendants yelled, "Slava Ukraini!"
Good stuff.
Yep. In a second trial for some other terrorist shit, a bunch more fascist salutes and Slava Ukrainis. Bandera said he was the quote-unquote leader of the OUN and commandant of the UVO, or Ukrainian military organization. He admitted ordering the killing of Polish leaders as well as OUN members for the quote crime of betraying the nation. And this is a thing that like he in particular was really obsessed with, was like murdering other Ukrainians because they were traitors or whatever. I'm assuming so that people would be really scared to, betray the Ukrainian nationalists. He admitted to ordering the assassination of the Soviet consul Anton Krushenitsky and the bombing of the Soviet newspaper office Pratia. He announced himself fascist leader of an enslaved nation. He also said, quote, "Our idea is so huge that as it comes to realization, not hundreds, but thousands of human lives have to be sacrificed in order to carry it out," end quote. He said that this was an integral part of, and this is a great one, he actually called it permanent revolution.
Where have I heard that before?
I don't know.
I don't know. Sticks in my mind.
So like after this trial, the cult is like firmly established. And from this point forward, the OUN fully adopts both the fascist salute and the Slava Ukraini as their slogan. And then they wrote songs about Stepan Bandera.
You mentioned after we finished recording the last episode that one of the inciting events for the OUN was the execution of Petliura by the Soviets. Are you getting into that, or is that?
Yeah, I will address it briefly, but if you want to talk about it more, you can. But it inspired probably the largest OUN-led pogrom, which they like actually named the Petliura days.
Jesus Christ. Yeah. So for people who may have like forgotten, Petliura was the leader of the nationalist government after he invited basically imperialist powers into Ukraine to help to fight the Bolsheviks. And the quote unquote socialists who had been part of the nationalist government up to this point all resigned because they wanted nothing to do with this. So Petliura became sort of the de facto leader of nationalist Ukraine, but he presided over pogroms, many, many, many pogroms that were done not by rogue forces, but by his military. And so, I mean, I'm sure Justin will get into it, but that's who that is. That's who that guy is. And so it's wild to me because if the whole deal of the OUN is we want independence, why do they give a shit about a guy who was like, I want foreign powers to come in and help us? And they occupied, I mean, like I mentioned in that episode, that French troops basically controlled the streets under Petliura. It was they dominated sort of policing the behavior of Ukrainians, particularly left-wing Ukrainians during that period. So it's weird to me that this guy's a hero to them.
Not to me, because these guys were fucked in the head. So again, to kind of draw it back to the main purpose of my talk, which is to like demonstrate how fash these dudes were. Did the OUN support the mass murder of Jews officially? Yep. Steppy's second in command, Yaroslav Stetsko, wrote in his autobiography that he supported, quote, the destruction of the Jews and the expedients of bringing the German methods of exterminating Jewry to Ukraine, barring their assimilation and the like. A couple weeks after the Lviv pogrom, which I'll outline later in the episode, the OUNB held a meeting of its propaganda sector, and in it, the head of propaganda, Stepan Bandera, asked another of the group, Oles Halavko, to characterize the Jews for him, and he replied, quote, the Jews are very arrogant. It is necessary to treat them very harshly. They cannot be kept in the cities. Absolutely. We must put an end to them, end quote. A report from the OUN propaganda to OUN security service wrote about the Petliura days, which is a massive pogrom that happened in Lviv, which I'll discuss later. But it started, the first day was in collaboration with the Nazis, and then the next 3 days were just basically Ukrainians. And in this report, quote, proto-priest Father Tabinsky, which is a member of the Greek Orthodox Church.
Proto-priest?
Proto-priest.
All right, then.
Literally what they called him. Informs us, our militia is at present conducting, together with German organs, numerous arrests of Jews. According to reports that proto-priest Father Tabinsky received, among our militiamen are supposedly people who, for money or gold, release Jews who are supposed to be arrested. We, unfortunately, have received no concrete facts regarding this manner, but nonetheless, we provide you with this information to make use of. Slava Ukraini. Yeah. At this point in the history, Bandera goes from being like a Nazi darling to the Nazis being like, we got to keep this guy on a short leash because we don't want him basically pushing the bounds of like his perceived Ukrainian state into like our newly occupied territories. So they didn't imprison him necessarily as much as they just like made him stay in one particular area. And so on June 30th, 1941, as Germans and Ukrainians entered Lviv, shortly after the beginning of Barbarossa, in a meeting room in the building of the Prosvita, or Ukrainian Culture Society, the establishment of a Ukrainian state was announced. This is the second one, boys. They wanted to do it in like one of the more imposing buildings, such as the State Theater, but Daddy, aka the Nazis, had already occupied it. Steppy really wanted to be there, but Dad had slapped him on the wrist, so he was stuck in Komshichnia, I'm sorry. To prevent him from organizing in, like I said, any of the newly organized territories or occupied territories. Instead, Steppy's boy, the second in command, Stetsko, made the announcement, all men, women, and children gathered there were to commit themselves to Stepan Bandera and swear an oath of loyalty to the Ukrainian state. Slogans around this time included, quote, long live Stepan Bandera, long live Adolf Hitler, end quote. One poster read, quote, to stop this Jewish communist brigandage, to help Ukraine liberate itself, Adolf Hitler, the great leader of the German people, has ordered the steel-clad columns of the invincible German army to set off into battle and to destroy the bloody lair of the Jewish Bolshevik commune once and for all. The German soldiers come to us as our friends. In our towns and villages, Ukrainians are welcoming them as their liberators. Another one, quote, no, Moscow Hungarians, Jews are your enemies. Kill them. Do not forget, your leadership is the leadership of the Ukrainian Nationalists, OUN. Your leader is Stepan Bandera. Your aim is an independent, united Ukrainian state, end quote. On the 30th of June, 1941, this part's fucked, a group of 10 Jews were forced at gunpoint to print the OUNB posters and propaganda material that would then motivate the crowd to kill Jews over the next 3 days in the Petliura days. In that summer alone, there were 153 recorded pogroms in Galicia and Volhynia alone.
So I'm going to have to step in here and call bullshit on everything you just said in regards to Bandera being an anti-Semite and participating in pogroms, etc.
Oh, shit.
Is right here. I'm going to read out again another quote, except this time it's from Stepan Bandera, who's actually the grandson of Stepan Bandera. He's a Canadian journalist, and he actually works as a producer for CTV in Canada.
So a very reliable source is what you're saying?
Yeah, no, very reliable, very reliable. So he's quoted as saying, in an interview last year, he said, this is quoting from the article, Steve Bandera, a journalist and Canadian citizen, has steadfastly maintained for years that his grandfather and the Ukrainian nationalist movement in general are innocent of perpetrating war crimes against Jews. It's a viewpoint that some historians see as Holocaust revisionism. Bandera said he was unable to tell from firsthand experience what his grandfather thought about Jews. However, he told the Jewish Telegraphic Agency in quotes, the anti-Soviet activism of my dad, there were a lot of Jewish colleagues and allies, and his father made an effort of reaching out and working together with Jews that were on the same page. There you go.
Okay, well, fuck.
Well,
End of episode, I guess.
Yeah. Sorry, let's wrap it up, boys.
Yeah. So some of those allies that they're talking about were just like the Nazis, the Ukrainian nationalists used Jewish doctors and such. Like they kept them alive, right? They didn't kill them in order to treat their wounded or whatever. But like the second that they had the opportunity, they would just kill them. Or if they were like injured or something, or if they pissed them off or whatever, right? They were just basically prisoners. So those are the Jewish friends that they're talking about. And that, like, as I talked about earlier, the Greek Orthodox Church and the OUN were important allies. So Stepi, Linkovsky, Stetsko, and Matvienko were all sons of Greek Orthodox priests. So the church initiated a Ukrainian Catholic Union, which collaborated with the OUN. That same group then launched the Catholic Action of Ukrainian Youth, whose leader was none other than Andrei Melnik. And when Stetsko announced the Ukrainian state in the office building with some people around him in 1941, the head of the church announced that Stetsko's government, Stepan's government, and the Ukrainian state had come into being by the will of God, and that, quote, we welcome the German army as an army which liberated us from the enemy, end quote. By August of 1941, the OUN-led Ukrainian militias, which were basically, so the Nazis made the OUN essentially illegal, but they used the OUN members in German organized Ukrainian nationalist police or militia. But these militia already in August 1941 were too fast for the Nazis. The Nazi security police reported in Krakow, quote, in several places it was necessary to take action against the Ukrainian militia and its leaders, since plundering and assaults were daily occurrences. In Ternopil and Ravine, Polish families were murdered by them. In many places, the local and field commandants had to disarm and dissolve the militias and arrest their leaders. The behavior of the militias is to some extent such that even the Ukrainian peasants call them, quote, Bolshevik hordes, end quote. A few days later, quote, Ukrainian militia commanders continue to shoot people they don't like, end quote.
Jesus.
Yolp. So the OUNB, or the OUN split, happened in January 1940, a year before the establishment of the quote-unquote Ukrainian state. In a conference in Vienna, when Bandera demanded that Melnik remove two of their leaders from power whom he suspected of collaboration with the Poles. He also demanded that Melnik include people that Stepi wanted in leadership, and they wanted Melnik to exile to Switzerland until the war was over. Melnik, of course, refused, but offered Stepi the post of advisor to the leadership. Bandera and his buddies marched out, and on February 10th, 1940, declared a revolutionary leadership, denouncing Melnik and thus cementing the split. They both weaponized anti-Semitism to denounce the other. OUN-M claimed OUN-B leader Iari was a, quote, Mongolian Jewish crossbreed, end quote, while the OUN-B said that OUN-M leader Styborsky was a traitor because he married a Jewish woman.
No, you're Jewish.
No, you're more Jewish. Yep. So, yeah, again, tell me how the OUN was not anti-Semitic.
Mm-hmm.
And if the OUNB is being led by Bandera, then how in the fuck could he not be anti-Semitic?
No, but his grandson disagrees.
Yeah.
Fuck, you got me again. The OUNB now splits and has kind of its own ideology, which was most influenced by socialist turned ultra-nationalist Dmytro Dontsov, who wrote Nationalism in 1926, which Lev Shenkovsky, OUN member and future leader of the monstrous UPA, called the OUN's unofficial Bible. Dontsov, through his books and essays, preached amorality, might, the aggressive warrior spirit. He championed conflict over peace, hatred over love, hierarchy over equality, and will over logic. He despised weakness and passivity. He became a great admirer of Hitler and Mussolini, published both of their biographies. In his preface to Hitler's biography, he praised him for his anti-communism and also his anti-Semitism. He believed in the formation of a new post-liberal society based on the rule of strong races and nations.
Cool guy.
Yep. As the Nazis are pushing the Soviets back further into the USSR, in one of the towns, the NKVD executed 150 political prisoners on their way out. Rumors immediately surfaced about the NKVD's extreme sadism, quote unquote. They said that the NKVD threw them into boiling water since their corpses were found without skin. They said they marched a priest through the streets and set fire to his beard, cut off his heels, tongue, nose, and plucked out his eyes. Although repeated over and over in publications, there has never been any eyewitness testimony to any of this. And based on the fact that the corpses were buried for a number of days before they found them, like that kind of, to me, explains why the skin would be like peeling off. But regardless, it led to really nasty pogroms, which we'll talk about later.
Yeah, I guess just for anybody who's wondering, we are going to isolate detailed descriptions of the pogroms to the end of the episode, kind of like we did with the last one, because if people don't want to hear that, they can skip over it. So it's all sort of concentrated in one place. It's always rough. There's always terrible things being described, and we don't want to subject anybody to that who might have some kind of history that makes that difficult for them to hear. So,
yeah. Later, when the Bolsheviks then would push back the other way, it ended up spurning a group that murdered over 50,000 Jews in a massive pogrom. And all of the leaders of the Ukrainian Nationalists scattered to Warsaw, Prague, Paris, Berlin, and Vienna. But we'll get to the post-war stuff in a little bit. Even beyond the mass murder that the OUN committed on its own, they collaborated heavily and eagerly with the Nazis. The OUN mayor of Rutski, when asked to provide a list of Jews in the area for Nazis to exterminate, provided the names and locations of 1,349 Jews. In Kamenets Podolitsky, the SS killed 23,600 Jews, almost all of the town's Jewish inhabitants. And mass extermination requires a lot of effort, though, and the Nazis didn't have enough resources to do it alone. No problem. The OUN city mayor distributed 50 copies of an order for Jews to register to the local police before 6 a.m. the next day. They also did all of the distribution of Jewish property and valuables after their murders and internment in the areas where Ukrainians had governmental positions. In Galicia and Volhynia, Ukrainian police rounded up and transported Jews to the Nazis for their implementation of the final solution. And it was standard practice for them to execute the disabled and elderly on the spot so as not to overburden the Nazi death camps and squads.
Jesus.
In the Operation Barbarossa, the chaos of it, Bandera and Liebe ended up escaping their exile and then gathered in Krakow. In September 1941, 33,000 Jews were shot in Lviv. 6 months before the first Nazi death camp was opened, Reich Security Director Reinhard Heydrich gave a speech on June 17, 1941, which was then summarized in a telegram to Einsatzgruppe leaders a week after the invasion of Soviet-occupied Poland and then Ukraine that read, quote, "One should not put any obstacle in the way of efforts at self-cleansing arising in anti-communist and anti-Jewish circles on the territories to be newly occupied. On the contrary, one should provoke these, leaving no traces, intensify them if necessary, and direct them on the right track, but in such a way that, quote, local defense groups, end quote, would not later be able to cite orders or political promises made, end quote." Once the Nazis crossed the line into Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, however, Einsatzkommando 6 of Einsatzgruppe C reported to his superiors, quote, "Almost nowhere can the population be persuaded to take active steps against the Jews. This may be explained by the fear of many people that the Red Army may return." And like just briefly, I kind of want to address the difference between Jews in Western Ukraine and in Soviet Ukraine. So after Soviet Ukraine was established, it flourished under state-sponsored Ukrainianization. Cultural life was vibrant. Ukrainian literature, theater, and visual arts were exciting and innovative. Many periodicals, books, and films were produced in the Ukrainian language. Civil servants took courses in Ukrainian so that the administration could function in that language, which I think is pretty fucking cool. Like how many governments would do that, you know what I mean? After like taking territory, essentially.
Right. And like it obviously flies in the face of this mythology that Ukrainian nationalists have developed that while the Soviet Union persisted, Ukraine was under the thumb of Russia.
Right.
It's there's no evidence for that. They had their own isolated government, which operated not independently. Obviously, they were working together as one nation, but they were able to establish policy for themselves.
Yeah. And ethnic Ukrainians played major roles in the state and party leadership.
Right.
A Ukrainian language educational system was developed encompassing all levels of education and was built from scratch because it didn't exist.
Right. Because under the Tsar, this was not a desirable outcome. Like the Tsarist Russia oppressed Ukrainian identity. And I mentioned the sort of the Russification project that they put into place.
Yeah. And unfortunately, like the end of the 1920s, between dekulakization, the famine, and like it really kind of opened the door to the right-wing propaganda machine, the dissolving of the Comintern. It ended up turning a lot of Ukrainians against the USSR. But under the Soviets, obviously, it was very different for Jews. While some resented their stores and such being nationalized or having to take Red Army soldiers in during the war into their homes and apartments, life was much better than it was before the war. The Soviets, they said, were cultured and polite. The anti-Semites were scared to reveal themselves. The Poles were afraid of repression. One man who's 11 at the time said that after the Soviets were pushed out of Poland, his father stopped sleeping in their home because he was scared. An investigation of memoirs from 1947 of Ukrainian immigrants by Dr. John Paul Himka shows that Ukrainians from the old Soviet territories were much more horrified by the mass killing of Jews and Roma than Galician Ukrainians, who often ignored the Holocaust altogether in their memoirs of the Nazi occupation or even implied that the Jews deserved their treatment.
Right, which I think speaks to, again, the fact that this behavior is not like inherent to Ukrainians. It is a matter of who has control of the education system, who has control of the propaganda, and what kind of guidance are you receiving from your government? What kind of education and what sort of messaging are you receiving is going to change your behavior. And that should be obvious to everybody. But under, again, Soviet Ukraine, you were not receiving the same messages as you would from an OUN government.
Right. Or even before there was a government, just
Right,
the OUN apparatus, which basically spoke for the Ukrainians that were in Poland. But in the waning years of the Great Patriotic War, World War II, the OUN's already kind of pivoting away from terrorism as an official policy. They're really starting to kind of see the writing on the wall and what they're going to do after, if things go south. And so they wanted to open the door to a legitimate government that might come to pass, and they wanted to distance themselves from the Nazis. But of course, they were still really interested in, terrorism and murdering of Jews and Poles. And so they created a new decentralized organization called the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, or the UPA. Now, at this point, this is really where people point to a lot of look, the OUN wasn't bad, is because they just created a whole nother wing to do all the terrible shit for them. So the number of Jews murdered by the UPA is all over the place, from 150,000 to a few thousand. Regardless of the actual numbers, it happened, and it happened in large numbers and in brutal ways. They also murdered over 60,000 Poles before the Soviets liberated Poland, mainly by surrounding entire villages, herding the residents into the largest building, and then burning it to the ground. That was their standard practice as they came into, as they were leaving, basically. As for the Jews, at this point, there was a lot of, I don't want to say refugee camps, but refugee groups that would just gather in the forests and stuff, outside of these towns, so that they could not get murdered. But that made it really easy for the UPA, who would just move in the area, surround them, corral them, and then just murder them in large groups.
Just as an aside, John Paul, who you mentioned, he's the uncle of Chrystia Freeland, who is Canada's deputy prime minister.
Oh, really? Interesting.
And yeah, it's incredibly interesting because he's maybe one of the most prolific, writers on the topic, at least in English. But despite this, Chrystia Freeland is very evasive about the history of her grandparents who were active Ukrainian nationalists.
Of course, yeah.
Anyways, I just want to mention that.
Right. So at this point, I guess, before I talk about the details of the pogroms and then kind of the aftermath or the rehabilitation of the OUN and Bandera, I want to draw back to the constitution that the OUN wrote before the establishment of their quote unquote Ukrainian state. And this draft declared that the Ukrainian state would be based on a totalitarian dictatorship of a nation that would be defined in a nationalist sense and racial sense, and therefore would grant rights to ethnic Ukrainians alone. Other than the OUN, all political groups, parties, and other organizations would be banned, and the leader of the nation, Stepan Bandera, would hold office for as long as they wanted. And so that kind of, to me, cements in my mind the impossibility of the OUN being in any way a benevolent organization, any way a non-fascist organization, even though they called themselves not fascist. That was because they were they saw fascism as a strictly Italian thing, right? So they couldn't be fascist, but they embraced all of the ideas of fascism. And the only reason they fought the Nazis was because once the Nazis used them to push the Soviets out and to kill a bunch of Jews, then all of a sudden the Nazis were like, no, we don't want you here anymore, fighting for our territory, and then made them illegal. So of course, then they started to fight, and then literally whitewash their history.
Yeah, after the Nazis used the Freikorps, which were a group of ex-military mercenaries in Germany, they used them extensively to sort of commit acts of terror and act as a paramilitary force to help them in various situations. But once the Nazis became the dominant power in Germany, they had this big ceremony where they retired the Freikorps, and anybody who resisted in this dismantling of the Freikorps were arrested and in some cases executed. Because again, this is how these sort of fascists operate. They have to be able to consolidate power. They have to have a monopoly on that power. And if they can't control and have it under their direct sort of oversight, then they don't want to have anything to do with it.
Yeah. And there were like multiple, dispatches and such that stated, like from the Nazis, stating that to make sure that no promises were made to the Ukrainians, but that the ideas were encouraged, like the ideas of creating their own state, and that they would have that would be encouraged, but not expressly, officially sanctioned.
And of course, that does not mean that the Freikorps or the OUN were the good guys.
Right. Yeah. Just because,
just because the Nazis were like, we can't control you, that doesn't mean.
Exactly. Just because they got killed by the Nazis or imprisoned by the Nazis doesn't mean that they were good.
Yeah.
In any way, shape, or form. And I'll get into that. Initially, I was unsure as to whether to even talk about this stuff again, because, Jeremy talked about it in the last episode, and we are not interested in like making tragedy porn or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
But in the end, like, obviously I didn't write everything, but in the end, I think it's important to demonstrate the inhuman way that the OUN and its allies treated people in their, quote unquote territory. And so I will list some instances to kind of show how fucked up that is. And I also think that, again, while we shouldn't constantly be talking about it, I think it's also important to not talk about it. Because I don't want us to kind of distance ourselves in some academic way to like what actually occurred on the ground.
Right. Because these were human beings who suffered in a very human ways at the hands of monsters.
Yeah. So in these, I will talk about a lot of fucked up stuff. I mean, anything that you can possibly imagine, probably, from rape to child abuse to, graphic images and stuff like that. So if any of that is going to make anyone too uncomfortable, then you can probably just skip the rest of the episode. But yeah, content warning. In June 1941, as Germany pushed the Soviets back in Ukraine, as I talked about earlier, they found the corpses of prisoners. The Nazi estimates are 2,800 to 4,000 prisoners across 4 prisons, but obviously that's Nazi, like, whatever. It's Nazi shit. So it could have been or it could have not been. I don't know, and it doesn't really matter. The OUN, who joined the Nazis as the National Militia, incited pogroms in retaliation against, quote unquote, Judeo-Bolshevism. And, this kind of alludes back to what I talked about earlier with the memo from the Nazi government saying, like, don't expressly, condone it, but encourage it. Now, the known Jews in the EU were marched to the prisons, those prisons where the prisoners had been executed. And once they were there, they were forced to carry the corpses out of the prisons and line them up. Jewish women were forced to wash the corpses and kiss their hands. The ones that carried the corpses were beaten, often to death, with rifle butts, metal bars, spades. Once too many were killed, they would go out and get more Jews from the city. One of the survivors remembered how one particularly well-dressed Ukrainian patriot would, quote, beat with an ironclad cane. After a while, he beat only against their heads. With every hit, he wrenched off strips of skin. He put some people's eyes out, wrenched off ears. When the cane broke, he immediately took a large charred piece of wood and smashed my neighbor's skull. The skull broke and the brain splattered in all directions, also on my face and clothes, end quote. Many Jews were just lined up and shot. Of approximately 2,000 Jews brought to just one of the prisons that day, 80 survived. They would throw grenades into the groups of Jews and then beat the injured before telling any survivors that they were to be back the next morning by 4 a.m. In the other prisons, it was much the same. Women were stripped and beaten. Pregnant women were beaten in the stomach. They were forced to give up any and all possessions. The most attractive Jewish women were selected to be raped and then killed. Jews were forced to clean the prison yard with their fingers, to clean toilets with their clothes, to clean horse shit and put it in their hats. They were thrown from windows. A Nazi saw some Jews with bloody noses, and a Ukrainian explained how it was custom to twist their noses until they broke and then demonstrated for the Nazi. They were forced to move paving stones with their hands from one side of the street to the other while being beaten, to move dirt from one side of the street to the other. One woman was tied to a man and forced by blows to run in opposite directions. A teenager was beaten unconscious and then buried alive. A man was forced to carry a Ukrainian on his shoulders who beat him on the head until he collapsed. A survivor remembers how Ukrainian passerbys, quote, stopped for a moment or two, some to laugh at the ridiculous look of the victims and went calmly on, end quote. On July 1st, the bloodiest of the Lviv pogrom, which resulted in 2,500 to 3,000 Jews being murdered on that day. Large groups were brought to sports fields and trapped in there with no food or drink for 2 days, getting beaten the whole time. After the pogrom, they were stripped of rights in the city and only allowed to shop for 2 days out of the week. All in all, over the 3 days, the Petliora days, 7,000 to 8,000 Jews were killed. The OUNB, of course, later denied any involvement, although many were named and there's pictures of them doing it. One warned a Jewish woman who he was in love with to leave hours before the main pogrom started. So they not only participated in it, but had to have had knowledge of it happening before it happened.
Right.
Poles also participated, but were outnumbered by Ukrainians despite being Poles being the mass majority in Lviv. On another occasion in Lviv, thousands more Jews were brought to a stadium by the Ukrainian militia, where they were made to do push-ups and then run a gauntlet of Nazis and Ukrainians who would beat them with thick sticks. Most of the survivors, about 2,000 people, were then driven in trucks outside the city and shot in the forest. On July 5th, one of the local pogromists, Felix Landau, wrote in his diary, quote, "There were hundreds of Jews walking along the street with blood pouring down their faces, holes in their heads, their hands broken, and their eyes hanging out of their sockets. They were covered in blood. Some of them were carrying others who had collapsed. We went to the Citadel, which was where the NKVD had recently had its headquarters, and there we saw things few people have seen. At the entrance to the Citadel, there were soldiers standing guard. They were holding clubs as thick as a man's wrist and were lashing out, hitting anyone who crossed their path. The Jews were pouring out of the entrance. There were rows of Jews lying one on top of the other like pigs, whimpering horribly. The Jews kept streaming out of the Citadel, completely covered in blood." Fast forward to the winter of 1943, 1944, when the UPA was now the militant wing of the OUN, and they would corral Jews and communists into labor camps. And when the Soviets pushed close on their march to Berlin, they would murder everybody in the camps and then retreat. By summer, the UPA started to whitewash itself, declaring equal rights for minorities. But in practice, this meant absolutely nothing. They continued to murder Jews in mass. Stepan Bandera declared that, quote, "One program should be addressed to the members and sympathizers of nationalism, and the second for external factors, which can change according to the circumstances and external factors." By the fall of 1943, it's clear that the Germans would lose, so the OUN leadership in Ukraine issued an order to compile, quote, "lists that would confirm the Germans carried out anti-Jewish pogroms and liquidations by themselves, without the help or participation of the Ukrainian police, and instead, before carrying out execution, urged the Jewish committee or the rogues themselves to confirm with their signatures the presence of Ukrainian police and its involvement. Also to create and compile, quote, material that would clearly confirm that the Poles had initiated and taken part in anti-Jewish pogroms, end quote. This was sent, quote, in strictest confidence, end quote, to, quote, the oblast circling county leaders, end quote, of the OUN. In 1943, the OUN UPA leadership had already ordered the destruction of documents that connected the leadership to the pogroms. Western intelligence service collaborated with him, as I told you, despite the fact that they knew the truth, to help with the whitewashing. Bandera's assassination by the KGB in 1959 turned him into the ultimate martyr for the right wing. An OUN leader and writer and friend of Bandera, Lebed, retyped a ton of documents from the war in order to remove or downplay the OUN's role. And then after his death in 1998, they were donated to the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, who considered them originals, and invited far-right historians to review them and popularize their content among quote-unquote patriotic historians in post-Soviet Ukraine.
I would, in the middle of this, Serhiy Plokhy is a Harvard Ukrainian historian, and he was named. And I'm sorry, I don't have the name of the person, but there's an entire school of Ukrainian study there, which is named after a socialist Ukrainian historian from, I believe, the 19th century, it's all of this coming together as like this weird, again, sort of obscuring of reality and obscuring of the truth and whitewashing this history. It all makes sense.
Yeah. And like the estimates from just the Petliura days alone are all over the place, from 1,500 to 20,000. So it's like hard to say where the numbers lie, but regardless, it happened, and it happened in mass, and it was fucking savage. There's another story about a teenager that was thrown into a wood chipper. I mean, it's totally fucked. But like in the 60s, England opened a museum for Ukraine, essentially like the victims of communism, basically, in which, and this really kind of started the public push for Ukrainian nationalists, OUN, Stepan Bandera. I think it might have even been the Stepan Bandera Museum, as to like how they were heroes that fought Nazis and communists instead of fucking monsters that did the exact same shit that the Nazis did, but just got beat by the Nazis. So in and this is essentially concludes, my talk, but real quick, I want to address how in 1991, 70% of Ukrainians voted to renew the USSR, but the end of the Cold War was bad for Ukraine. And right-wing history took over, kind of slowly started to rewrite history. In 2006, the Ukrainian government tried to make it illegal to call the quote-unquote Holodomor anything but a genocide. In 2010, Ukrainian President Yushchenko declared Stepan Bandera a hero of Ukraine. But even in 2013, a Gallup poll found that 56% of respondents in Ukraine said the fall of the USSR did more harm than good, while only 23% said that the end of the USSR benefited their country in any major way.
Yeah, Ukraine has still not recovered to its pre-Soviet dissolution GDP. It still has not recovered.
Yeah.
There's, I think, Russia and Poland. Oh, God, I'm trying to remember. There's only a couple of countries which have recovered again to their pre-Soviet dissolution GDP. It's a
I think
huge
countries
minority.
probably like Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. I think those are some.
Maybe
Those countries also became Soviet afterward.
Yeah. And there's, I think it's Tajikistan, but that's another one that improved their GDP, but only because the US government like dumped tons of money into it in order to basically be a haven for Muslim extremism, in order to push back against Pakistan and Afghanistan later.
Right.
But yeah, and we'll do another episode on like kind of modern Ukraine in the future. So I don't want to get, into that right now, but yeah, it's fucked.
Yeah. And also one on Soviet Ukraine, because I think it's going to be important to have that contrast of one against the other.
Yeah. Ukraine is, perhaps the most important story or cog in the history of the Soviet Union, as far as just because the histories are so different. Like it runs all over the spectrum as to like the truth or not truth or whatever. And so, yeah, that's, I think, why it's important to focus so much on Ukraine. And then, of course, because Ukraine is in the news right now. And so there's a lot of like questions about these things getting brought up again.
That about does it for this episode. Thank you so much to Justin for all that great information, and to all of our listeners and Patreon subscribers. The newest ones since the last episode are Nanyo, Sean, Joseph, Antonio, Another Filthy Peasant, KRG, Elijah, and of course, our Vanguard member, Braden. Once again, if you would like to subscribe, you can do so at patreon.com/prolspod for free. If you have questions, comments, or episode ideas, please email us at prolspod@outlook.com. Please follow, review, and do all that stuff that helps the algorithm to point people in our direction. And we will see you in 2 weeks. May the specter haunt your streets, and solidarity forever.
Rossolinski-Liebe.